I want to start with you by talking about the fires because I know that this has been disruptive to your business, and also you've been doing things to help. We can see the air quality behind me, still terrible here in the Bay Area, but it is nothing compared to what these families are going through north of us. You know, what has Airbnb been doing to help?
Yeah, I mean, obviously what we've seen in Northern California and Southern California, I mean, is just devastating. Obviously, we've seen some tremendous heroism from the first responders, from just everyday people. And we've been just honored by our hosts. We've had over 2,500 hosts open up their homes to over 1,800 people who've been displaced by the fires. That's not really Airbnb, that's our hosts. And we're grateful for that. I think they're appealing to the higher angels that are in all of us, and it's just awesome to see amidst all of this catastrophe. So thank you for asking. Obviously, we see the air here. We're feeling it here in San Francisco, but nothing like what people are going through on the ground. Right.
Our hearts go out to all of them. You know, I do want to talk about growth. You're going into the holiday season, typically a very big season for Airbnb, and you just reported a record quarter. You say you have record bookings over Thanksgiving weekend. How long can you sustain that kind of growth?
Well, as we released on Friday, significantly over $1 billion in revenue in Q3, our single biggest quarter ever, and we are blessed ultimately by this really significant and robust growth. But ultimately, that's tracking to the community model that exists on Airbnb. We only do well if our hosts do well, hosts only do well if guests do well, guests only do well if communities are benefiting. But that flywheel does create a network effect globally, and you can see that underneath these growth numbers: 91% growth in Beijing, right? Over 70% growth in places like Mexico City or even Edinburgh or Birmingham in England, just to pick out some from around the world. But ultimately, what's really underlying the foundation for all of that is that people are looking for this type of travel, right? More people are going to be looking to do home sharing type of travel, people-to-people travel tomorrow than today. Now, this is not new, right? Abraham Lincoln, Gandhi, they did home sharing. But in particular, this is what consumers are looking for, particularly those millennial consumers who are going to be 75+% of all consumers going forward. This is how they like to travel.
Give me an update on Beijing because, you did have a head of China that resigned there over a Me Too issue. I know that one of the founders, Nate Lacharczyk, went last year. But you mentioned 91% growth. You're starting from a fairly low bar because the business was small to begin with. But how do you expect that to expand?
Yeah, again, looking at our global numbers, what we're seeing in China really does reflect the same thing that we're seeing globally, which is we are blessed with this growth that is being driven by that network effect that exists locally. But what we're seeing in China is really interesting. It's the same sort of underlying dynamics and trends that we saw with the business earlier, which was when Airbnb was first launched, the majority of the users were millennials. If you look at our China market right now, about 85% of our consumers are millennials. Similar trend, keeping in mind that there are 400 million millennials in China, right? We are really, the significant player in what's called the outbound travel, people going from China abroad. But what's happening is they come back and then they begin to travel domestically, and Airbnb begins to grow as a result of that. And so the type of growth we've seen in Beijing is actually replicated. It's similar numbers depending where you are looking throughout the country. But look, at China is a place you have to get up every day and you have to work incredibly hard. We do have a president of the business who's from China, based on the ground there. We have an incredible team made up of Chinese folks who are on the ground in Beijing and other offices around the country. Feel good about where we are, but know that we need to keep working at it.
You quietly removed some listings in the Jewish West Bank settlements, and this is something that pro-Palestinian groups have been pushing for a long time. But why now?
Yeah, look, this is, as I'm not the first one to say this, obviously, an incredibly complex part of the world, an incredibly difficult issue. This first came up early in 2016 when we were really first confronted with questions about 150 to 200 listings that exist in the West Bank, the occupied territory. And really, since then, we've spent a lot of time trying to understand the issues, talking with experts, stakeholders, and put in place a framework to help us really sort of reach a decision here. And that framework includes understanding that every situation is case by case, talking with those experts, our stakeholders, taking a look at the degree of human suffering and what's contributing to it, and really looking at trust and safety issues, and ultimately whether our product, our business, our listings are contributing to the core issues there. And using that framework, ultimately made the decision that we need to remove those listings. We say that knowing it's controversial, that we're not necessarily going to make anyone happy here. Look, I've traveled to Israel. It's an incredible part of the world with incredible people. And this is a really hard choice we struggled with. We're not a government. We're not necessarily the experts on this, but because we're in homes, we often get put into these situations and do ultimately believe, at a time when a lot of people are talking about, our tech companies, our platforms going to take responsibility, that we wanted to act as opposed to necessarily react to situations. And we use that framework to help drive that decision.
You've been looking for a CFO since Lawrence Tosi left. Still haven't hired one. Why is it taking so long?
Are you interested?
Are
you coming for it? Yes.
It might be a conflict of interest.
Just a little. We've had, not surprisingly, given the historic nature of the company, some of the issues that we have talked about, that there is incredible interest in this particular role. We've had incredible folks that we've had conversations with. I will be sure to let you know when we have reached a decision on it. But we've talked about the fact that we want to be IPO ready by 2019. We haven't announced if and when we would take the next step beyond that. But ultimately, we are going to be looking for someone who really does appreciate that community model, right? That we are looking to be a 21st century company, that we get growth in the following way. Do we deliver for our hosts? Do our hosts then deliver for those guests? Those guests deliver to the community. What's really interesting about the Airbnb model, and I think why we've gotten so much interest and why I think this is going to be an interesting role, is that ultimately if we drive a social value proposition, that actually drives our growth. And that ultimately comes back to the early question that you asked, which is how do we continue this growth? We continue this growth by delivering on that community model.
Right. You ended forced arbitration, not just for sexual harassment, but for discrimination, which is very progressive. We haven't seen other companies do that yet. How do you plan to handle this between hosts and guests?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Our model is a little bit different maybe than some of the other sharing company models. Our hosts are really, our partners. We do have a really aggressive policy called We Accept, which broadly deals with discrimination types of issues. And you have to agree to those set of standards before you can even come on the platform. But as it relates to our employees, which is what we announced last week, I do think that is also another example of how we're trying to build that community model. Okay, I come out of, as you know, out of Democratic politics originally in the U.S. I did a lot of labor politics when I was working in Democratic politics. And for me, it's just personally, it's incredibly interesting and I actually think really exciting to see that companies understand the value of their employees and their community. Employees are pushing for companies to be responsible. I think it's awesome. I mean, I think it's great that you have these employees and these companies understand they only succeed if they're able to attract and recruit these great candidates. And it's a pretty cool thing to see that beginning to develop and hopefully a good indicator of where we're going as a society.
You mentioned your time at the White House, which is a perfect segue for me because every time you come on here, I have to mention that you were the master of disaster, known as the master of disaster. So how would you master Facebook's disaster right now? Like, what are they doing wrong?
Well, I will be very careful here
able to contain this?
Because I obviously don't work at Facebook and want to be really respectful. I would say, without talking about Facebook specifically, but as a general approach, I do think ultimately people have to be comfortable with what their mission is, what their principles are, what their values are, and really do the best to try to proactively execute against those. We talked earlier about whether you're going to be proactive or reactive. And again, I'm not talking specifically about Facebook, just talking writ large in the context of how people should think about these things. At the end of the day, you have a North Star. Your North Star is your mission and your principles. Those only really are true and viable if you're actually executing against them. And that has to be when you have the hard decisions, right? It's really easy to say all those things when it's an easy decision. It's when you have a hard decision that you really get tested. And I remember working in politics. Politicians were always tested, not on the easy stuff, but in the cauldron of a crisis, because that's where your character really gets exposed and you have to make some decisions. I know some of the folks at Facebook at the top and throughout the company, I think really good people. And I think ultimately, they will be doing those. I think they have tried to do those, and at some level have done some productive stuff. But obviously, I don't know what's going on there, and I'm really not in a position to evaluate exactly what they're doing.